Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am delighted because today we're covering a very, I think, exciting subject. And my guest is Anuradha Gulati. Hello, Anu.
Hello, Anna. Nice to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm so pleased you're able to do this because I won't tease my audience any longer. I must tell them what it's about. So it's your book, Heal Your Roots, and it's your ancestral roots, and it's about releasing family patterns. And I think this is such a huge, huge subject. So in my practice, both as an analytical hypnotherapist and as an astrologer, I see these themes coming up, and it's very, very powerful when we're able to track ancestry and see how these patterns unfold. So how did you, dare I say, stumble into this area of research and work?
Oh my goodness. As you said, I stumbled into it. But when you say something like that, you realize at some level it was probably meant to happen, because I had spent all these years in academia and finance and very sort of left brain stuff. And I had this health problem and I got sick and I had to go into the ER. And there's that, when you stumble the first time, you think, I'm just going to get back to what I was doing before. This is just a little roadblock, a little like hiccup. But one night out of nowhere, I had to go back into the ER again. And that's when I started to feel like, oh my God, what's happening? Like, I don't know. I'm really not in control. But I came out, and it was when I had to go in the third time that I started to feel, I don't know what's going on. And I started to get really scared. But I had a very good friend, and she came to see me in the hospital. And, she looked at me and said, how many times are you going to go through this? What is it going to take for you to change? And, I feel I live by her words even today, because I literally willed myself out of that hospital and I began to explore alternative methods of healing. So I found this amazing Chinese medicine doctor, and as I started to heal right about that time, I also discovered flower essences. And that's when I was getting ready to get off that path that I'd been on. And that's how I sort of began with flower essences and then ended up with ancestral energy work.
It's extraordinary, albeit not surprising, how often I hear the story that a crisis perpetuates change, because we're creatures of habit, aren't we? And we'd rather sweep things under the carpet rather than deal with them. So it does take, and it is that moment where somebody says to you, well, what's it going to take to get you to change? And quite literally, somebody said that to you. And I have asked that question of many a client that's sat here with me. And I've said, well, can you see the repetition? At what point are you going to change? And I can remember when I was training as a hypnotherapist, our teacher saying to us, your clients are not paying you to make them feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And it is that, isn't it?
Yes. And, I think there is this part about imagining possibility, because when what that whole incident taught me, and I don't think it was at that moment, but in retrospect, what I realized, how important hope is in our life. And it's so important to nurture it and keep that flame alive. And I think when we get stuck in these repetitive patterns, um, something needs to break the pattern, to shift the energy, to allow and infuse new energy. And either you do it, like you said, even with hypnotherapy, perhaps something has to open the door to imagining possibility.
And that's right. And it's one of the things that is very clear to me is that wounds are handed down through generations. In astrology, there are parts of a chart that show the ancestral wounds. And I use a chart very often to help my clients see what they had not yet seen before a little bit more clearly. And we know that in the womb, for instance, a fetus could be flooded with cortisol and then grow up to be more predisposed to depression. So there's a lot that goes on before we are even born. And this is something that we really need to understand. We need to understand why so many cultures have ancestral worship or ancestral links at the heart of their belief systems. And we did once upon a time and have lost that. So tell us about how you see this. How do you see this ancestral link?
So I want to actually just say, you see it through astrology. I understand even from Indian astrology that you can see patterns and gifts from grandchild to grandparent. But when I started seeing clients and I started to see patterns repeat, I'd forgotten all of that. And I started thinking, am I going crazy? And in the most simplest of instances, like a mother would come and wanted to repair a relationship with a daughter. And the daughter's moved like far away to the West Coast, doesn't want to have anything to do with the mom. And then, I discovered that the mother and her own mother are not on talking terms. And, I started to see patterns in my own life. And I was like, wait a minute, this is something really strange. And that's how I started to look for answers to this. And you're right. So many cultures had ways of honoring the ancestors. And one of the most, the quotes that I like a lot is actually by Alberto Villoldo, who's this Cuban-American medical anthropologist. And he said when he went to South America and saw the ancestral altars, he said, in the West, we think of the ancestral altar as a way of worshiping the ancestor. He was like, when you create the altar, you just want to know where they are. Otherwise, they're running amok, ruining your life. And I thought, when I read that, I was like, that so struck me that you're trying to anchor that ancestral energy to prevent it from ruining your life. And so all these traditions, the Native American traditions, so many Eastern traditions, the Celtic tradition, the All Souls Day, All Saints Day, were ways of honoring the ancestors so that they're not ruining your life or acting as a ceiling on your life.
I was just thinking about that, the 10 Commandments and the one that's honor thy father and mother. And we perhaps might be reluctant to do so if we're feeling somewhat rebellious and angry over the way that we were parented. And I feel very strongly that respect is something that should be earned and not taken for granted. But I think that the meaning of that commandment perhaps is not what we now interpret it to mean. I feel more that it's a reminder that our parents are who we are. We are not who we are by a random cause. We have arrived here, and sometimes I feel like we're, you know, in with the old cassette tapes, for those of us who still remember them, if you copied them, you lost a generation, the quality deteriorated a little bit. But it was still the same tape. And it feels to me like this ancestral business is a little bit like that, or hopefully we're not losing a generation and deteriorating, but perhaps we might be the representation of a saga, a story saga, and each generation hopefully refining the story, improving it, and being the best version of that family line that it can be. And sometimes we succeed, and other times we bring dishonor to our ancestry by making things a whole lot worse. So I think that's how I've come to see it. And you talk about your term for it is the family energy field, and I'm very curious to hear more about that.
Yes, and you're so right, Anna. You're so right, because we are so just so many things that you've talked about. We are part of this family energy field, and transgenerational patterns is the energy of what is unresolved in the family field. And when we are born into that lineage, we are taking on a piece of what is unresolved or what is unhealed to heal it. And so when that pattern shows up in our life, it's what we have actually taken on to heal. So when we do that, we not only heal ourselves, we heal those who came, before us, up to 7 generations before. And because we are the ancestors for those who come after us, we heal those who come after us. So it's like you claim your place in the world. You do what you were born to do. You go from fate to destiny. You create your destiny. And an important part of that is, like you said, honoring your parents. And I feel, there's an African proverb that says, when you cut your chains, you free yourself. And we're on this journey of letting go of the baggage. But when you cut your roots, you die. And so the honoring of our parents is like the honoring of our roots. And it doesn't mean that we acknowledge that we, sort of say what they did was right, or we just accept that was. Because so many people are trying to fix their parents, to fix something. And actually, you can't do that. And then the expectations are there, the frustration is there. But when you start to just accept, and remember, the commandment is not saying love your parents, it's just saying honor them, which means like, that's what it is. It is what it is. There's no arguing with reality. Just accept reality and then move on. Then you're actually free to move on. Is when you struggle to accept reality, you sort of stay stuck because you want it to change, but you can only change yourself. You can't change what came before.
And it's also seeing ourselves and the things we struggle with within a context. Again, we didn't come to be who we are by accident. There is a story about how we got here. And so I guess that brings me to something else, and that is that this energy field, family energy field that we're a part of, does not exist in isolation. That energy field is also part of a wider culture. And so consequently, there is this narrative of trauma, which is due to the fact that we are part of history. That's what I was wanting to say, is that we exist within the context of our family history, but our family exists within the fabric, within the context of history. And so there is, as we know, history is full. It is one traumatic event after another. And we, as part of our family energy field, are often buffeted by this historical trauma. So when I'm dealing with clients, I'm very conscious of the culture that they belong to, because that culture will have a series of traumas which will have impacted on their ancestry. And my question is, how is it affecting them now without even realizing it?
Yes. And, I think when you do the work, you probably see how it's affecting them. And a lot of time, so the trauma creates like an automatic response, like an inability to trust others, and, being really tight-fisted. All of these are trauma pattern responses. Families where people shut down, don't communicate, there's no communication, there's no expression of love. In fact, what I saw when I was training in the ancestral work is that trauma expresses, there is a loss of expression of love in the family and the flow of love. And so, that's what happens. And when we don't get, we're hardwired in some ways to perceive love or expect love in a certain way. And so when we don't get that, when we are not feeling validated or seen in the family context itself, we start to think there's something wrong with us. But actually, what we are reacting to is the trauma response that is imprinted and is getting passed down to us. So when we open our eyes, we start to become conscious of the way in which we are reacting to this trauma response, So
how can an individual see that the issues that they're experiencing aren't by accident, that they are part of a wider family trauma?
I think, when you start to look at what is keeping you stuck, like when you start to look at what is it that you really want to shift, and you've tried hard, and, in some cases, it might be a relationship, it might be personal success, professional or career goals or something, and something stays stuck, and you start to look at it, you'll find that there's a pattern somewhere. Something has been happening in a certain way, and it goes back. And that's the thread, because it's like a labyrinth. You're using the pattern as like, that's the thread that's taking you to the heart of it. And then when you learn what you need to learn, you easily find your way out. So it's like, then the pattern has a message for you. And, let me just give you this example of a client, which might sort of make this a little clearer. I had this young woman who came to me because she was really having trouble with her family. She had dropped out of law school. She was in her second year of law school. And in the US here, it's 3 years. So she dropped out of law school, and it had sort of caused this big rupture in her family. And then as we talked, it turns out that her mother, who was this incredibly bright woman, dropped out of college, eloped and got married, and then got pregnant with her. And, so that was the end. And so you can see the mother is already triggered when her daughter is dropping out of law school. And if we went back a generation, the grandmother was doing medicine and dropped out to get married, then got divorced and went back to medical school. So, when I brought it up with this young girl and I said, look, this is a family wound. Education, relationships, your self-worth, your own power. What is it? You need to find the truth of who you are. And as we started to work together, she began to explore what is it that she wanted? What did she want to do with her life? And in this process, finally, she did decide to go back to law school and get her degree. But it was from this place of like, this is what I want. This is who I am. So, getting to that space of your own truth is like the healing energy that shows up. And, I feel the ancestral field comes to support you when you start to make the change. It really shows up.
It's complicated enough when we are considering projections, parents projecting their wishes, their dreams onto the child. It's complicated enough when they expect the child to live out their unfulfilled dreams, or they project their negativity, things that they see things in the child that they hate within themselves, and you want to punish the child for that. That's complicated enough without throwing in these patterns. And it's funny because in your book you mention it, and I've seen it, bankruptcy. It's where somebody in the family really makes a good deal of money and loses it. And it seems that subsequent generations, that's exactly the pattern of making a lot of money and then something happens and losing it. This is harder to explain, and yet I can see how it happens, how it comes about. What's your take on it?
On the bankruptcy or just in general?
Well, things like the bankruptcy, situations that apparently are out of an individual's control. So you think, well, how unlucky can a family be that 3 generations running, they're doing really well, and then world events happen, and that's it, everything's gone. And it seems mysterious because it seems to be out of their control, that it's just happening, and yet there's a reason for it. So I guess what I'm saying is there's the stuff that you can clearly explain because of behavioral conditioning, one wound creating a certain behavior, which is then creating more wounds, etc., etc. You can see that makes sense. There's a thread. But what I find fascinating is when it appears to be that third party that comes in and says, you know what, we don't like your family, we're just going to get rid of it all. So what do you feel is happening there?
It's very interesting because I just recently had a client with this issue. Grandfather, father, and husband, ex-husband. And, one of the things is the belief system. What is the underlying belief system? And it turns out that, there was an underlying belief, money is everything. And as as she worked through it, her own relationship with money, this ambivalence, because money is just one facet of life, an important facet, but is the belief system like money is everything, or with money I can have this, because a lot of, at the end of the day, our happiness is dependent on relationships. And then the other, it's interesting because in India, I really noticed at this time, I'd seen it before, but this time it was very much in my awareness. If I would pay for something in cash, the man would take it and he would do this, gesture of respect, like bring it up to his forehead. Treating money with respect, ultimately that it is like a divine flow. So when you're looking at your ancestry, when you're looking at the earth, when you're looking at the source of that flow. Money is a flow. Wealth is static, money is a flow. When you're looking at how do you respond to that flow of life? How do you receive? And do you see yourself worthy of keeping that money? Do you feel that you're worthy enough to deserve it? So there are underlying belief systems that, are to be explored, which are causing that pattern.
Absolutely. And it's how many times have I had a conversation with a client over the contempt that's there for money and how it's been passed on. And you think, okay, well, you hate it, but you want it. Which is it? This is a conflict that's there. And it's this ambivalence towards money runs deep within society. It's supposedly the root of all evil, after all. And well, actually, it's not. It's the desire for it. When it becomes obsessional, that could be the root of all evil. It's greed that's the root of all evil. And maybe at the heart of greed lies fear and issues around security. So we're back to that then, maybe being the root of all evil. We're always having to, aren't we, go back and see where's the root cause of this.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the root chakra, which is the family chakra, your sense of security and abundance actually sits in the root chakra. So it's so connected. Your sense of stability, security, abundance all sit in the same place energetically in your body, which is also our, the seat of our connection to the earth, where, through which we can connect with the nurturing, mothering energy of abundant earth. And yet, that's another part that we sort of forget about or ignore.
Yes, and more people are forgetting that the earth is abundant, and what is being preached from the rooftops at the moment is scarcity. So this is something that we're going to take a while to work through. So we're talking about tracking ancestral themes, but what happens with people whose families are so broken that they can't go beyond one generation?
I think that's true. I personally did not know my grandparents. So, I write this book on ancestry. I never met my grandfathers. I met my grandmothers a few times, one more than the other, but she was an invalid and bedridden. So I don't really have memories of interacting with her. But I do feel like when you honor your ancestors, whether you create an ancestral altar, whether you do practices for your lineage, or whether you do prayers for your ancestors, for their well-being, it doesn't matter if you don't know them. The sheer act of honoring your lineage, your maternal lineage or paternal lineage, starts to allow that family energy field to calm down. Because what the ancestors want is to be acknowledged and remembered. And it doesn't matter if we don't know who they are. I feel it doesn't matter because I don't know my ancestry, but I do my prayers for my ancestors, on a daily basis. And I think the other part is really, even if you do nothing with your ancestry at some level, if you decide to no longer be a victim in your life, you actually free yourself and heal everybody, because we're stuck in the blame game. But deciding to free ourselves is tremendously healing. If you don't know anybody even in your family, if you let go and say, I'm not a victim of what came before me. And that's really what ancestral healing is to release the feeling that you're a victim of your lineage. The moment you do that, you're free.
And I think I would add to that perhaps it would be helpful also in instances where we're less familiar with family history to understand cultural history too. And so to understand and honor that as well, because it's become extremely fashionable in this push towards globalization to annihilate or attempt to erase our individual cultures and pretend that there are no borders and so on. So I think it is important that we honor the culture that we are born into. We don't have to agree with everything and pretend that it is better than everything else. It is what it is. There is light and dark within everything, and every culture has contributed beauty, and every culture has contributed to the horrors of the world too. So keeping that in mind, it's important because when we do this, we are honoring ourselves. We are saying to ourselves, I am human and I am valuable. I have roots. I have roots, just like you said, I have roots. And my roots, the deeper they run, the healthier I become.
Yeah, I think you said that so beautifully, Anna. And it is so true. Yes, our cultural roots are what nourish us because that's what our ancestors followed. And I just want to share because we were in Portugal for a very short vacation, and our guide actually talked about the big earthquake that happened in Portugal that destroyed most of Lisbon. And he said, and it's really struck me because he said, it was November 1st, and the candles had been lit for our ancestors. And he said, my grandmother still lights those candles even today. And so when the earthquake hit, like the tsunami hit and it caught fire. But, I thought that was really beautiful. That those candles are lit even today in homes, honoring ancestors and the culture. I mean, that is so beautiful. Those are parts of you that you carry. Why forget it? It nurtures you, it nourishes you. Yes, tradition can be suffocating too at times, and that's the tension we all live with. But that's life. That's what we're walking the tightrope on between suffocation and freedom. But it also nourishes us. And we have to recognize that.
I might add that if memory serves, that earthquake was in the 18th century.
Yeah, I think he said 1755.
18th century. And it's not been forgotten. It was the destruction of Lisbon. It's not been forgotten. So you see, trauma, that was a traumatic moment in Portuguese history. And here we are, 2023, and still it is remembered.
Yeah. It was so vivid. Even I could feel it. Like when he talked about I was like, it felt so alive, like standing there in that square listening to him. It was unbelievable.
So what can people do to begin to better understand and start this process of healing that family energy field?
I think there's a few things people can do, one of which is to honor your ancestors. And if you struggle with your parents or grandparents, maybe just start with the lineage as a whole. And there are a couple of ways of doing it. I mentioned in the book how you can do prayers for your lineage. You can also create an ancestral altar. And in the book, I talk about how you can create one too. And it's just don't put it in the bedroom. And you don't have to have images or photographs of your ancestors. You can simply use, something from the part of the world your ancestry originated, or something from nature. It doesn't have to be photographs or, something like that you say, okay, this is it. There's a lot of freedom to do that. The other is, again, the transgenerational patterns is the energy of unresolved emotions. What's unresolved is the event, but the emotion is what, travels through time. The tsunami in Lisbon, in Portugal, the sense of fear stays there. We saw the tsunami evacuation route, even though there hasn't been one since then. So the emotions travel through time. Fear, anger, sadness. I mean, most of the times joy gets lost in all of that. So one of the ways of dealing with the emotions is really journaling. Journaling is a great way of taking emotions out of our head onto paper. Being in nature is another way of like just expanding our emotional range, calming ourselves. And then I feel like, what we forget is we got to resource ourselves. The universe is there to support us. So, going back to that sense of faith, which was there in every culture, not just your ancestors, but a sense of belief in something greater than ourselves. And so finding that, and if it's been lost, like when did it get lost? How did it get lost? And, starting to explore that. When did you stop believing in something, in imagining you were being taken care of, or that there was possibility? And, I think those things bring us back home to ourselves, because that's where we need to come to, like home to ourselves.
Yeah.
And all of these pieces help us do that.
I would, of course, add that there is one other thing that people could do to help them better understand this process and and find a route to healing, and that is find your beautiful book, which is called Heal Your Ancestral Roots. This is the book that we are discussing today. And Anu, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. I loved hearing your comments and observations. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at the yoga of sound. Until then, have a great week and goodbye.